Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and in today's lesson we're going to begin in the 26th chapter of Luke's 23rd chapter, and we're going to take it as far as time allows. So the only thing we really need to communicate about the 22nd chapter is there are three places actually. The room where the Last Supper was held, and I've done one on Luke's version of that, and also the Garden of Gethsemane, so that describes the agony, and then he's captured, betrayed, physically escorted, violently blindfolded, and escorted to the first of the trio of trials which anticipate the material we'll be covering. So he enters three judgments: one, the Sanhedrin; two, Pilate; to Herod Antipas. And these three authorities, the Sanhedrin, were the recognized tribunal, authoritative tribunal, 70 men, Sadducees and Pharisees, who collectively carried the weight and authority of the Jewish religion. They were the uncontested authorities, but so they trap him for a sin according to the law of Moses, blasphemy. But what they say is quite different when they turn him over to Pilate, who turns him over to Herod, and then they form a friendship over that. So we just want to cover a few of the verses from the 67th verse of the preceding chapter. "If you are Messiah, say it to us." And he said to them, "If I say it to you, you would not believe it at all. And if I asked of you, you would not answer me at all. From now on, the Son of Man shall sit on the right hand of the Almighty Yahweh." So there's one of two ways to interpret that. One is as a self-reference, and the other is as a reference to someone else. The nature of the Jewish question is concerned with the nature of the language, and they and they all said, "You then are the Son of Yahweh." And he said to them, "You say that I am." So the word "I am" in itself would have been blasphemous. This is Yahweh's sacred name in the Hebrew language. I am. Yahweh means I am what I am. So even though he said, "You said that I am," they interpreted that elastically to stretch it out to a blasphemous claim. And they say, "Why do we need further witness? For we heard of ourselves from his mouth." So that settles his judgment with the Sanhedrin. But in order to, the Jews had no authority to kill even their own without proper Roman oversight and authorization. So then they turn him over to Pontius Pilate. He is the current Roman governor of the Roman district called Palestine, of which Jerusalem would have been the center of. And they say quite different things from what the Sanhedrin charge him. Second verse, "We found this one corrupting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Messiah, a sovereign." So there are three claims in this, all of them libelous. One, that he was corrupting the nation. He was bringing moral revival to a spiritual graveyard. He wasn't corrupting the Jewish nation. He was bringing life and vitality to it. He settled the controversy of paying Caesar to Caesar, and I believe Luke has a version, but one relatable reference is Matthew's 22nd chapter and also Mark's 10th, where he settles the controversy of paying owe to Elohim what is Elohim's and give to Caesar's what Caesar's is, after he asked for to physically hold a coin and ask whose inscriptions is on it. So he did not, in fact, endorse that thing they were charging him of. And they said that he himself is a Messiah, which would have been a Jewish term, but then they qualify that it's a king, and that word will excite any Roman who hears it, because they are very literal-minded people. They take interpretations of any kingship unauthorized by Caesar as treason and sedition. But, he asked him this question, and he says, similarly worded, are you the king of the Jews? And he said, "You say it." So he doesn't take it as personally as do the Sanhedrin. Remember, he said, "You say that I am," verse 70 of the 22nd chapter. And so Pilate is settled. He tells the crowd, "I find no guilt in this man. He's innocent in my judgment." So, but then he turns him over. They reiterate their claim that he was stirring up trouble in all the regions of Palestine, Galilee, and he was a Galilean, so he knew that he was under Herod Antipas's jurisdiction. That would have been the division of labor of Herod's sons, who was the Roman authorized puppet monarch of Idumean stock. And seeing Yahshua, Herod rejoiced greatly. For a long time he had wanted to see him, because he had heard much about him, and was anticipating to see some miracle done by him. So his main interest in beholding this troublemaker who was stirring up such a reputation was to have him perform a miracle for his personal entertainment and vindication. He is a carnally minded man who has no interest in anything spiritually, and was questioning by him with many words, but he gave him no answers. So he wouldn't even humor or satisfy or dignify any of these questions or these requests for miracles or anything else. And the chief priest and the scribe stood, accusing him intensely. So the Sanhedrin hasn't gone anywhere. They are still in Herod's palaces, judging and accusing libelously this man. But we read that in the 12th verse that Pilate and Herod, who had former enmity between them, are reconciled on that day. But that kind of explains what happens. You brought this man to me as one who turns away the people, and look, I have examined him in your presence, and I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. So for the second time, Pontius Pilate, he's the one addressing this crowd. For the second time, he tells him that he is innocent in his judgment, and neither did Herod. So Herod came to the similar conclusion, even though these priests and scribes were standing by, accusing him intensely. They could not persuasively or persistently enough to persuade Herod to charge him with the crime. Then he expresses his determination to release, according to the Jewish. This is the Passover season, the final day. We Christians call it Good Friday, but it would have been the final, most significant day of the Jewish calendar, the Passover date. And Pilate his conscience is somewhat conflicted at condemning an innocent man, and he tries to weasel his way out. So it's this struggle between doing what is right and doing what is popular. He offers them an opportunity to take advantage of the custom of allowing one sentenced criminal to be released out of respect for their holiday, and they make it plain that they prefer Barabbas, who was a literal agitator and revolutionary against the Roman Empire, so he represented far more a threat to these Roman people. But Pilate, he was going with the crowd at this point. He had succumbed to peer pressure. Once they expressed their interest, there was no final resistance from him, only a third insistence that I have somewhere. There may not be a third insistence, but he implicitly suggests that he is innocent just by his determination to release him, an offer they reject in the 24th verse. And Pilate pronounced sentence to that what they had asked should be done. So the Jews had accomplished their purpose of petitioning the Romans for the license to crucify them according to their law. And in the final verse of the passage before we're going to cover, we read, he handed over Yahshua over to their wants. So Herod is out of the picture for all intents and purposes from here on out. Now he's at the mercy of the mob, which is determined to crucify him, and that is exactly what they proceed to do. First verse 26, and as they led him away, they laid hold to a certain man, Simon, a Syrian, who was coming from the field, and they put this cross on him to bear it behind Yahshua. So Simon may have been converted by this experience because he carried the cross, which is necessary for all our conversions. We are called to be cross carriers, to bear our burdens and to carry a cross, whether literal or metaphorical. One thing we all agree on is that if there was a cross in his life, there must be one in ours. And his sons Rufus and Alexander, who are referenced in Mark's 15th chapter, 41st verse, their names are mentioned in Romans 16:13, so they may have had, he may have been the father of Christians too, because those names align with what we read in Mark's account. And he was from Cyrene, so he had traveled. Cyrene is west of Egypt. It corresponds to the modern country of Libya. So he had traveled some 800 miles to be there on the Passover for this most solemn occasion. And here he is out in the field randomly, minding his own business, determined to get his worship on. And he is called to carry a cross because the Messiah had been beaten. The cross weighed some 250 pounds, and the Messiah, Luke is kind of silent on the details of the mocking and the belittling that went on. I think Matthew may give the most graphic description of that. But for any case, we're just going to move on. And a great number of the people were following him, and women who were also mourning and lamenting him. The truth is that in the New Testament, Yahshua does not have a single enemy who is a female. He is the liberator and elevator of females, giving them dignity and equality and worth. Certainly, if not in this lifetime, then certainly in the next. He was conceived by a virgin, and the first witness to his resurrection was a woman he had liberated from 7 demons. Mary of Magdala, we read of in the 8th chapter, 2nd verse, that she was once demon-possessed, and he liberated her from those demons, and she was the first one to witness the resurrection on the next day. But Yahshua, turning to them, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." So he knows something that they don't know, that in 40 years their city is going to be toast, their temple is going to be razed to the ground, their city is going to be reduced to a smoldering ruin because of people like Barabbas persuaded the Jewish majority to rise up and rebel against their Roman masters, and their rebellion was brutally crushed by the future emperor, then the emperor's son, Titus, who belonged to the same dynasty as Domitian, who was his younger brother. That's the one who persecuted Christians such as John and exiled him to the penal colony of Patmos, where he wrote the capstone book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation. So he knows the beginning from the end. He is the Alpha and Omega. He knows in his prediction he offers in the 21st chapter, I think, is the Luke's version of the Mount Olivet Discourse. He predicts painfully that not a single stone shall be left standing on the temple that you are beholding and visibly admiring at this particular moment in time. For look, days are coming in which they shall say, Blessed are the barren, and wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. So on that day, the day of desolation and ruin, it's going to be better to not have brought any child into the world, because every creature is going to be fighting for survival of their life, and their literally last day of life, and the children are just a hindrance to any mother who has that mutual responsibility between themselves and their children. So it's going to be better to not, you can't escape the fact that you were born if you are there, but it is better that you did not give birth if you find yourself there. Then they shall say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. So they're going to be so desperate for mercy, the sweet release of death, that they're just going to pray for the mountains, a massive physical mass to fall on them and kill them and crush them and just get this life over with. To be covered by the hills means no room for escape, no way out of it. You're covered. One cannot be uncovered from something as monumental as a hill. Because if they do this to the green tree, what is going to be done to the dry? And 2 others also. So that question is one we, in all honesty, don't know the meaning of. It's one of those mysteries where we have to confess our ignorance, but we encourage the reader to discover that thing out for themselves. I probably should have researched that verse a little more thoroughly than I did in preparation for this, but got to live with that. And 2 others also, evildoers, were led with him to be put to death. So Yahshua was crucified in the company of three, and he's usually depicted in the physical image, the paintings, as the center, surrounded by two other criminals, evildoers. Now, crucifixion was not the ordinary means of Roman capital punishment. It was reserved for the enemies of the state, those who represented a genuine threat to the Roman state and people. So no Roman citizen could be crucified, and that's why Paul was spared of that fate. He was beheaded, which we can accurately imagine was the more common means of execution of capital punishment amongst the Romans. But they were there for the same reason. He was there to be put to death. Why else would one be hanging from a cross but to be put to death in the most unspeakably painful and agonizing and excruciating way possible or even imaginable? And when they had come to the place called Golgotha, they crucified him there, and the evildoers, one on the right and the other on the left. So the painting of which I referenced earlier is actually accurate. He is in the center of it all, but Golgotha, now this is commonly referred to the hill of Calvary, which is rooted in the Latin translation of Calvaria, which translates as skull. So, and this is the Hebrew version, but that means the same thing. And just to get an appreciation for the range of language, the same Greek word, cranium, influences our word cranium. So it doesn't mean what we think we mean when we say the word cavalry. We envision an armed horse riding warrior, shall we say. But it doesn't mean anything like that. It is place where his skull and cranium were crushed. No kinder way or gentler way to put it, but that's exactly what happened there. And Yahshua says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." And they divided his garments and cast lot. So that's a true expression of their ignorance of scriptures. These Roman people or Jewish mob had just confirmed one of the prophecies of the psalmist in doing what he mentioned in the 22nd chapter, 17th verse or somewhere thereabouts. So they really had no idea what they were doing. They thought they were getting rid of a potentially troubling menace maker. This man did not pose the threat that the Jewish Sanhedrin thought he did to Rome. They were threatened by their own authority, and as such they turned him over to one who wasn't really a threat at all to Rome, but preaching obedience to authorities and respect for Caesar, and to pay taxes on the money which bears his inscription. What is his rightfully belongs to his. Don't try to upset the social order. Just live as you are called to live in whatever situation Providence arranges you to find yourself. And the people were standing, looking on, and the rulers also sneering with them, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Messiah, the chosen of Elohim." So we gather that the bulk of the mockery recorded in Matthew's account is in anticipation of the actual crucifixion. In Luke's version, it takes place on the cross. So these people are sneering at him, challenging and belittling and mocking his claim to be a savior, because here he's unable to save himself in his present predicament. And that would have been sufficient enough, conclusive enough testimony in their opinion to prove that he was the Messiah, the chosen of Elohim. Their picture of the Messiah was not one who was killed by his own people. That did not align with their envision of a king in a literal earthly, a warrior in the Davidic sense, and just the righteous king wielding secular authority. That just wasn't who he was, and they had struggled to adjustment. And this also, incidentally, this ignorance is reflected by two disciples whom we meet in the next chapter, one of whom is known as Amos, the other is anonymous. And the soldiers were mocking him too, coming and offering him vinegar, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." So the nothing really original or new material from the Roman soldiers, distinct from the Jewish mobs, except that they came to him mockingly, offering him vinegar. He had refused. In other accounts, we read a drug or an intoxicant, which would make the painful process slightly less painful and slightly more bearable, but still crucifixion is no fun, no matter how much, there's no amount of painkillers that can kill a pain like that. So he refuses. We can intuit the water that they offered, given in the spirit in which it was offered, in a mocking, reproachful intent. And they say essentially the same thing that the Jewish mob is. They're challenging, refuting, and mocking his claim to be a savior, because a savior, by the Roman definition of the term, would not be hanging on a cross, expiring before their very eyes. And there was also an inscription written over it in letters of Greek and Roman and Hebrew. "This is the King of the Jews." So the other accounts give more details over this controversy. The Jews demanded that it be amended to, "This is the man who calls himself the Jews," but Pilate says, "I have written what I have written." But this is familiarly translated as the famous INRI. Yahshua is his Hebrew name, and there are no... it's spelled with an I. There are no J's in the Hebrew alphabet, but we spell it with a Y, but they spelled it with an I. Nazareth was his hometown. Rex, R, stands for king. I of the Jews. Remember, there's no J's in the Jewish language, so they would have referred to themselves either as spelling with the Y or the I, and in this version they chose the I. But remember, it's a combination of languages, so Rex is a term that is Latin, and, there's Hebrew in there too. "And one of the evildoers who were hanged was speaking evil of him, saying, 'If you are the Messiah, save yourself and us.'" So that's got to add insult to injury, to have the same person who is in the same predicament of you saying the same things as the soldiers who are overseeing your execution, and the sadistic mob, which is getting pleasure and delight from your suffering and satisfaction from your suffering. To see a man in the same condition of you say something like that is just a total misunderstanding of who he was talking to, which the other evildoer, malefactor, however you want to translate it, does not make the similar misestimation. And the story here is demonstrable proof that salvation is not by works, but by grace and faith alone. Grace through faith. But the other, responding, rebuked him, saying, "Do you not even fear Elohim, since you are under the same judgment?" So he has a conscious recognition that he is perhaps in the presence of someone sent from Elohim, if not Elohim himself. This man had, in all likelihood, no religious education, rearing, or instruction. He certainly was never baptized. That eliminates the argument for the necessity of a water baptism for salvation, and he had never partaken the sacrament, yet he was eventually declared saved. And he says, "You're hardly in a position to be mocking this man, given the fact that you are under the same judgment. And we indeed rightly so, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. But this one has done no wrong." So he recognizes that they are guilty. He is repentant enough and mournful enough over his sin as to consider his reward just. So he had a different perspective on his suffering. He was under a conviction, perhaps stimulated by the physical proximity of his presence, but this compulsion, wherever it derives from or originates from, draws him to the correct conclusion about salvation. So, and as he said to Yahshua, "Master, remember me when you come into your kingdom." So he understands whose kingdom it is. It is his personal possession, his belonging to. He's asking him to remember him. That means invite him in. Remember this moment when he asked him to remember him eternally when you come into your kingdom, and we don't know who arrived there first, but they certainly arrived on the same day, and as the Savior assures him, he will meet him there that day. And Yahshua said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise." So paradise is not quite heaven. It is a blissful state which exists between the resurrection in heaven and a spiritual interlude where we go, so there's nothing automatic. And I personally subscribe to the theory that there are degrees of exaltation. Paul speaks of a three-tiered kingdom, celestial, telestial, and terrestrial, in 1 Corinthians 15:21, and he also references three kingdoms in the second verse of the 12th chapter of 2 Corinthians. So I interpret that as a degrees of glory. I don't think salvation is a democracy. I do not believe that this thief on the cross is in a similar degree of exaltation as is, for example, Mother Teresa or Billy Graham, just to use two exemplary saints. But he was there, and that was good enough. And, his eternal state of bliss is going to be blissful enough, because even though he had done everything wrong, for all we know and assume, prior to this point in life, he had come to the correct confession at his deathbed, and that was sufficient enough to merit his salvation and the Savior's assurance of his approval. And it was now about the 6th hour, and darkness came over all the land until the 9th hour. So the 6th hour begins at noon. That's not a normal time for darkness to enrapture, but it was as if creation itself was groaning in exquisite agony, while the Creator of itself bore the pains, the sin penalty of sin humanity, which has thrown into nature into a cosmic disequilibrium. And the darkness remained until the 9th hour. That would have been 3 o'clock p.m. So this is a nighttime during a time frame which is not customarily night. And the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. So the sun was darkened. It would have been out, but it would have been eclipsed by total darkness. There's something unusual and extraordinary and supernatural at work here, which we personally interpret as creation itself groaning in exquisite agony as the Creator of the cosmos bears the sin penalty of sinful humanity. And there's some significance in the veil of the temple that is interpreted as an open door. The veil divided the Jews from the Gentiles. That is the inauguration of a new dispensation where henceforth Jews and Gentiles are equal in brotherhood and salvation, and connected to the same community which calls itself Christian. And crying out with a loud voice, Yahshua said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And having said this, he breathed his last. So these are his departing words. He has the Father on his mind. He is preeminent in his thoughts throughout his life, and he just acknowledges him in respectful tribute. He says, "It's into your hands I commit my spirit. I have came to do what you sent me to do. It's over. I'm coming back to you. I will be restored to you, and humanity, an elect, may be reconciled with us in eternal solitude." That is the reason that he died on the cross. Without the righteousness, now this thief had no righteousness to call his own, yet he was clothed in the righteousness of the Messiah, and that's the reason that he died. He died to provide that righteousness for you. So take it or leave it. I strongly suggest the former, but it's ultimately a decision you might make. I hope if you're made it this far in the video, you are committed to being a Christian and all the blessings that entails, chief among them eternal salvation, which can come to the vilest of creatures, such as the thief, who there is no indication he did anything right up until the moment of time where he gave the correct confession. But what do we read in Matthew 10:32 and 33? "He who confesses my name before men, I will confess their name before the angels and the Father. And he who denies me before men, I will deny before the fathers and the angels in heaven," and that seals their eternal fate. So one of the thieves on the cross, we don't know the specific nature of their crimes. They were extreme and gravitas. There was gravity to them. but we know that one made the correct confession, the other is lost and doomed in hell as we speak. So I hope one of the reasons you're here is to avoid that lot in the afterlife. That's all the time we have for today. We're going to save the death, the burial, and the resurrection, combine those, what remains in the 23rd chapter with what begins in the 24th for a separate study. Those three factors are contained after this point, but we literally can't. We operate according to a 30-minute maximum, so that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.